Let's go in the talking room.
As Google's captain of Moonshots, Astro Teller directs the secretive laboratory where self-driving cars, smart contact lenses, and Google Glass were conceived and made real. I sat down with Astro at Tested's live show last fall to talk about the benefits of thinking big and failing quickly.
So the first thing I want to ask, and I don't know if you get this question all the time, Astro?
Yes!
That's your name. That's awesome. That is so. How did you get the name Astro?
It was a typo from Stanford. This was back in the days when you had to fill out the paper applications, and the guidance counselors kept saying, remember, don't leave anything blank. So on the very first page, in the upper right-hand corner, after like last name, first name, middle name, and I felt bad because I didn't have a middle name anyway, and then it said nickname. And I was like, oh my God, I'm gonna leave 2 blanks in the first line of the first page? Like, I'm never gonna get into Stanford. So there were like a few people in my high school who called me Astro. They thought it looked like my flat top on the top of my head looked like a patch of AstroTurf. It wasn't meant to be a particularly complimentary nickname. But anyway, I wrote Astro in the upper right-hand corner because I just didn't want to look like a loser who didn't have a nickname, even though I mostly didn't at the time. And
it's done.
And then there was, they transposed the names, so when I got to Stanford, they had become convinced that that was my legal name and that Eric was my nickname. And I went to the bursar's office to try to change this, and in this amazingly Kafkaesque moment, they required me to show an ID that said Astro on it before they would change my name. Which sort of makes sense, because they're like, you're not Astro, you don't have his ID. You know what, never mind. And so I became Astro.
And your official job title at Google?
Is Captain of Moonshots.
It seems like a haircut has defined your entire life.
I suppose. I'm not sure that it got me the title at Google, but maybe, who knows?
So can you describe, I want to talk about Google X and what you do there, but I want to talk about you as a kid. What was the sort of things that you got interested in and in trouble with when you were a young person?
You know, I wish I could tell you that I did more pyrotechnics. I lit more stuff on fire than probably most kids today do, and you should all go light more stuff on fire. That was good for us. But I didn't as much as I wish I had, actually. I was a more digital kid than a physical kid, but I was one of those classic kids who got like the first TRS-80 and like the Sinclair 99 4A, and my parents had no idea what they were asking for. They told me that they would buy me a pair of joysticks if I wrote Pac-Man in BASIC using sprite graphics. And this was like a 6-8 month project for me, and I was just so determined. I was like 10 years old that I was going to get this pair of joysticks. And afterwards, I'd made Pac-Man, and then I had the joysticks, and then I would just jam the joystick all the way to the left, and it was like, Pac-Man, ghost, 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 and then the Pac-Man would move again. It was so slow. It was really painful, but I felt very proud about having done it. So, that's how I got into technology in the first place, was the early computers. I had a Commodore 32 and a Commodore 64. And
can you describe in general what your job is over at Google X? I know we can't talk about a lot of the specific projects because many of them are secret, but overall, it's an amazing thing you're overseeing.
Google X is a very special place. We're trying to find really big problems with the world and go fix them. The presumption is that if we do that, that is both an exciting, purpose-driven thing to spend our time on, and ultimately that it will be financially beneficial for Google. And so we don't have to pick between being purpose-driven, solving real problems, and being financially motivated. That actually, if you pick the right kind of problems, you can have both. So the self-driving cars or the stratospheric balloon project have very concrete problems, like there's $1 trillion of loss associated with sitting in traffic every year. There's more than 1 million people a year who die in car accidents. Like, let's make that go away. There's more than 5 billion people on the planet who have little or no internet connectivity, and the associated GDP ratchet that their countries could get, the amount of incremental literacy and health and democracy that is brought to areas where improved connectivity happens is about as transformative as anything could possibly be. Let's go solve that problem. And like whether stratospheric balloon project, a platform using stratospheric balloons as a way to solve that problem will work, I guess we're going to find out.
So how many people do you oversee over at Google X?
Unfortunately, we don't give out that number, but it's a reasonable number.
Okay.
More than a few.
And while you have a very varied background, you have a lot of education, you're a doctor of artificial intelligence, but you can't possibly know all of the interstices of the things, of all the projects that are going on at Google X. How do you manage people if you're not completely inculcated with what they're working on?
Well, I mean, no one could possibly know in any business everything that everybody does. I don't think that that's reasonable. One of the wonderful things about my job is I get to spend a lot of time saying, I don't understand, teach me, like explain that to me. So I'm sort of a mile wide and an inch deep on a lot of different subjects, but because I'm sort of mildly versed in even the things outside of computer science, like electrical engineering, RF, analog, signal processing, mechanical engineering. Because I know enough of those things, I can have a conversation with people and at least have a sort of intro-level understanding of all the basic problems and opportunities, so then I can say, teach me. Right. And they don't have to start back in high school. They can start with, well, look, here, this isn't actually a photovoltaic. It's a different kind of way of concentrating the sun's energy, and then we're going to do this other thing with it. And I'm like, oh, I don't get it. How does that work? Is it a PN junction or isn't it? And like we can have what is probably a sophomoric discussion for them, but it's fast enough that it's still worthwhile. And I don't know, that's how it works.
So can you describe to me how an idea comes into Google X and how you guys vet it and see whether it is going to have legs for you?
They come in from all different places. The stratospheric balloon project is an example where there were ideas that we were kind of poking at, but weren't at all sure that Larry and Sergey were going to be excited about. And some of those have in fact happened. But there was a set of ones that Larry and Sergey were excited about, but it wasn't at all sure we could make happen. And one of those was the stratospheric balloon project. Another one was Project Wing, the self-flying vehicles for delivery project. Mm-hmm. Both of those, there was a much larger group of things where we said, wait, we already know they're excited about these problems and kind of about the technology. Can we de-risk these? Can we make it seem not completely crazy to go do them? And so we did that with a whole bunch of things, many of which kind of fell off the conveyor belt because they really weren't going to make it. But those two particular ones did make it through this process of us saying every week, like, how can we kill this idea as fast as possible so that we can get on to doing something else that really could survive? And that mantra of let's break it as fast as possible, let's discover as fast as possible, as cheaply as possible, that this is the wrong thing to spend our time doing, actually can make it really fun to kill projects, which is really important since we spend most of our time killing projects. And then we can celebrate, having t-shirts that say safety third on them and that kind of,
That's a fascinating philosophy, though, to try and kill it, because if it's, obviously it's almost Darwinian, right? Most of us suffer from all sorts of biases because we want something to succeed. But if you want something to fail and then it doesn't, you're sort of chained to it in the best way.
This is actually what I spend a lot of my time on with Google X, that if we all believe that our project has to work, then we're going to find some way to BS ourselves, to BS our manager, that it's going to work, even way past the point where we know in our hearts that it's not going to work. And we do that because we worried we're going to lose our bonuses, we're going to lose the people who report to us, we might lose our jobs, we're going to lose face with our peers. We have all of these reasons not to want to raise our hands and say, look, this is a dumb one, let's go do something else. And so if you can create a culture in which people actually believe, not that failure in the long run is acceptable, like, oh, we just kind of went in circles, but that's cool. Like, that's not cool. But if you can see each thing that you do as a purposeful experiment, there's no there are bad experiments to run. Like if you already ran the experiment, you just run it again. That's a dumb thing to do. But there's no bad outcome to an experiment if it was a thoughtful experiment to run. Think of a good question. Think of the fastest, cheapest way you can answer that question. Make sure that the answer to the question would actually change what it is that we would do afterwards. Go run the experiment. And then you can celebrate whatever the answer is afterwards. And that way of making progress, I think that's the rate-limiting step of real innovation.
Oh my God, I want to come to your barbecues.
Come over.
I totally will. So what is the percentage of crazy ideas that come in versus crazy ideas that actually proceed to the next step of experimentation?
Most of them don't make it sort of through the front door, as it were. So it's not like we're actually making, someone says, let's make a pillow that combs your hair while you sleep. And then we're like, okay,
that's a great idea.
What's the first thing that we should do to de-risk that project? Like, we're not going to do that, right? So there are ones that like literally don't make it through the front door. Then there are ones where someone says, what if we put a ring of copper around the North Pole and then use the magnetic flux of the Earth's core to harvest, there's a bee field that goes there, it's going up and down, and so you could get a current in that big copper ring, and then we could sort of pipe it back down to, I don't know, Sweden or something. Okay, like how much copper would that take? How much current would we really get? And that one died on paper, like it just turned out not to be a great idea. But that one was probably worth thinking about for an hour before we threw it out.
Right.
Then someone would say, like, how could we make power from an avalanche? How much power is there in an avalanche? It turns out that there's like many megawatts in a large avalanche, so it's not completely crazy, but since we probably don't want to go around generating avalanches, you can't just sit around waiting for an avalanche and then like quickly move in your like avalanche harvesting machine. So like that one died on practical basis before we even really did the math about it.
But you end up having this weird bit of knowledge base of exploiting energy from an unexpected source in a way that no one would consider. And since you've already gone down the garden path of thinking through how that might execute, the next time somebody comes with something that isn't so crazy, you've got a brain trust.
Yeah. I'll give you an example that's not quite as bad as like a cyborg army of robotic hamsters, but it sounds almost that good. As a interview question, because we obviously can't tell people what we're doing, so we want something that has artificial intelligence, maybe has some comms problems with it. It has to really have these meaty, hard, like get dirty in the world kind of stuff, because all the things that we do have those characteristics. I have often asked people a question about, let's say that we have robotic moles, and we're sending them out in the world, they're supposed to go find gold and bring it back to us. And then just engage them in a conversation about, like, how would we do gold detection? How far do you think one of those moles could dig before it had to come back and get power? Do you think it'd be realistic to, like, put a tether on it so that it wouldn't run out of power? Should we have conveyor belts, like, out its butt so that it could, like, send the gold back and just keep digging? What would happen if that mole, like, went, like, under, the ground into Canada or Mexico? Like, if one of the moles goes rogue, what are we gonna do? And you very quickly get into this state where you find out who's going to go with you on these journeys.
Yeah.
Because some people just kind of short circuit, and minute 2 of the questions, they're just like, I know. And then the interview often is over. They don't know it yet for another 28 minutes. But some people are super excited, and they're like, wait, I actually think we could do that. And, it's probably we shouldn't be making moles going digging for gold. We aren't. Don't get excited.
But if you find one, please return it.
Yes. But the people...
Don't take the gold out of its butt.
No, exactly. Oh, they don't like that. But the people who will engage in that conversation, that's a good sign.
That's awesome. You actually have one of our Mythbusters on your staff now.
I apologize about that.
He actually came and asked, one of our builders, Joe Sargent, came to me a few months ago and said, could you write me a letter of recommendation? I'm interviewing at Google X. And I thought, oh man, I would hate to lose you, but I will write you the most glowing recommendation I can because I want to work there.
Maybe you could ask Joe for a recommendation. Yes. He owes you one, apparently.
What does, aside from someone who goes with you on that journey, is there a type of education or type of life experience that makes an ideal employee?
No, it's really actually incredibly varied. We have people who are optics experts or digital signal processing experts, people who are experts in machine learning, people who have an automotive background because of the self-driving cars. It's incredibly varied. It's much more a temperament and ethos that we're looking for. So when we hire someone who was an ex-Marine, that seems like an odd thing to do, maybe, except that we have these field operations where safety and doing things precisely and occasionally saying we're sorry when things don't go perfectly are like important life skills. You want someone who knows how to manage a team of people. All of a sudden, this veteran actually is the perfect qualified person, it turns out, even though you might not, when you look at the resume, say, oh, that's a Google X kind of guy.
Yeah. So you're running Google X, and you are answerable to your bosses at Google. And I would imagine that you might take a project and try and kill it and try and kill it, and it seems possible, it seems feasible, and you go way down a path only then to discover that you've spent a lot of time and energy and it doesn't work. How tolerant are your bosses of that kind of failure?
Reasonably tolerant, but understand that that is one of the good ways to cause a project to fail. So it would be the dumb kind of failure if we had gotten to the place where the most likely reason that a project wasn't going to go forward was that Sergey said no, and then we waited a year to go ask him. That's real failure. That's not an interesting experiment. We think that's another experiment, the Ask Sergey experiment. So let's go ask Sergey. It's a relatively cheap, short experiment to run. So shame on us. So there's a time where you want to wait because you don't even know whether you're serious. The funnel's too wide at some point when you're out at the ring of copper around Santa Claus's house. But once you get a little bit more serious, you actually built a few examples, you've sort of convinced yourself it might not be totally crazy, then we go talk. And there are lots of things, right now we are not ramping up new projects very quickly because we have a bunch of projects, the self-driving car project, the contact lens that senses glucose, the airborne wind turbine, the energy kites that we're doing, the stratospheric balloon project, Google Glass, the self-flying vehicles, Project Wing, that was the one we most recently announced. And those are just the publicly announced ones. That's a lot of work to actually cause those things to move forward. And we're really dedicated to the idea that we're not an R&D shop, that we want these things to actually get out into the world and to change people's lives.
So it's not just pure research?
No, not at all. It's exactly the opposite. It's let's take the risk level of research, but then pursue it with the maniacal focus of a startup.
That's the ethos of attempting to induce failure in a project to only concentrate on the ones that resist that. It's actually kind of revelatory to me. I mean, we have a joke, and we came up with it early on in Mythbusters. I just said at some point, remember, failure is always an option. And then in retrospect, I realized it's a deeply scientific statement.
Yes, exactly. It's the null hypothesis. And if you pretend that it isn't an option, you're not actually running an experiment, or not an honest experiment.
You're looking to
speaking of which, there were the high-speed cameras here. We had this thing. So the energy kites are these things. They look more like wings, like an airplane without a body in the middle. And they lift off their perch, trailing this tether behind them. And then they go up really high, and then they go into this crosswind flight. And as air blows through this ring that they're painting in the sky, instead of driving their propellers to get up there, they're now harvesting energy. These are brushless motors, so you're turning something with magnets, and the magnets move against other magnets, and there's the copper wire, and so you just induce current in that copper, and then it just goes back down the tether, so you're actually generating energy, flying this kite in a circle. It seems too good to be true, but it's actually working. And so the tether is one of the really hard parts.
Yeah, I would imagine. So you need a lot of copper to get a lot of power.
Right. Well, and you can't have this huge copper thing because the weight of the tether when this is really long is actually a rate-limiting step for this whole thing. And the air resistance because of the cross-sectional area. So you want the copper to be as small as possible, and you want to sheath it in something which is as air has as low a Reynolds number as possible, but it has to be super strong too because this thing is pulling really hard. The one we're making right now is 100 feet long, so it's going like this, wind's blowing through it, it's sending 600 kilowatts back down the kite. Wow. So this tether is not just a string. So we put this tether on basically a complicated vise and pulled it with about, I don't know, it's like 20 tons of equivalent to weighing it down with 20 tons under here. We pulled it, and we had a high-speed camera. And when it broke, we got 1.5 frames, or like one frame where we could see anything. It was like there, and then there's a frame where it was breaking, and then it was gone. And this was a 3,000 frame camera. We're like, what happened?
Whatever happened in less than a third of a millisecond.
And we had to go out and rent a 30,000 frame per second camera just so we could get more like, 20 frames of it breaking. So, I think that there's this sense, maybe because we're Google or because the end results like Glass or like the new self-driving car that doesn't have a steering wheel and doesn't have a brake pedal and doesn't have a acceleration pedal, these things look shiny, and so there's this sense I feel from the world that we're all about spending a lot of money to get to these things, and that it's like, I heard this joke once that I can't remember if it was like Lawrence Livermore or something, but they said, why use aluminum when titanium would do just as well? And it's like this cost plus model where the more you spend, the more money you get. And that's exactly the opposite of what it's like at Google X.
You guys try and run lean.
Yes, we do try to run lean, but it's not just generally that we try to run lean, but there's this virtuous cycle where people are always saying, like, could we use balsa wood? What about foam? Because most of the things that we make are actually very sensitive to weight, for example. So the stratospheric balloon project, we care a lot about how much it weighs. Every ounce we can remove means the balloon can be smaller and we could put less helium in. We're moving to hydrogen right now, that's got its own complexities. We've had some fun purposefully blowing up big balloons full of hydrogen just to see how, make sure it can be safe.
I've done that.
It's actually kind of disappointing, it turns out, because it's rate limited by the oxygen, not by the hydrogen. So you can have a big bag of hydrogen and you'd stick a road flare in it and almost nothing happens because there's just not a lot of oxygen available.
But don't blow very hard.
Yeah. Well, it's also true. I mean, there's a kind of a diversion, but even when hydrogen bursts, it burns up, but there's this pressure that radiates outwards very evenly. If it were encased in something hard, you would get shrapnel, it'd be very dangerous. But if it's encased in like 1 mil mylar, it just goes away. I mean, you might get a suntan from a few feet away, but nothing worse. Like it just, anyway, so the point that I was trying to make was that finding ways to make things light, finding ways to make them inexpensive. When we're working on the self-delivery, the self-flying vehicle for delivery, how much it weighs is a huge issue for us. Yeah. Obviously, the more it weighs, the less we can carry as a payload. And, I mean, if the thing was made of gold, even if it did the mission perfectly every time, it would be so expensive to make one of these things that ultimately wouldn't actually change how the world moves physical goods around. So,
but then, I mean, I also imagine that there's a lot of speculation about how much Google spends on your department and that they have these deep pockets, but large, giant amounts of money carry with them their own inertia of bureaucracy and bias and desire. And it sounds like you're infusing Google X with a culture of attempting to be nimble by thinking through keeping things lighter, keeping them cheaper, keeping them simpler.
Yeah, and the more we can make things off the shelf, if we're going to put tens of thousands of balloons into the air someday, and they stay up for 100 days, maybe 200 days, hopefully we will capture most of these things again, but we cannot afford. The whole idea of doing something like this, bringing the internet to the other 5 billion people on the planet, is that these things cost a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of what it costs to make and launch a satellite. As an aside, it is also the case that you can run an experiment in a day instead of in 5 years, and I like those odds in terms of learning. Like, if you got it wrong, you can know that by tomorrow and fix it in a week and try something again. And satellites, like, you find out after 5 years whether you were wrong or not, but then you have to wait 15 years to amortize all the cost of that. Like, it's just, that's the ultimate technology lock-in. So finding ways to make it as inexpensive as possible isn't just a mantra about Google X. It's actually also about making sure that these projects don't end up in principle solving the problem, but not in practice solving the problem.
Right,
because
right.
if we really want to scale, if we want to change the world, everybody knows how to make clean water from dirty water. This is not a complicated problem. You can actually do it with relatively little energy. So you can make a little heliostat or something else to boil the water and then recollect it. But if you can't make it cheap enough, it's not going to be everywhere in the world that you need. You might as well not build it.
Right. Astro, I could go on for another couple of hours talking about this, but we have just run out of time. I really appreciate you coming.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Please thank Astro Teller. Thanks, man.
Just come by sometime.
I will.